I read last night the University of South Carolina is asking for a 2.9% tuition increase. Along with that, they're asking for a 3.5% housing increase, 4.2% food increase, and they're mandating that a kid who enrolls at USC have a health insurance. And if not, there's going to be some penalty, that you're required to pay anyway. And I started going through the math and numbers, and I text a person in the House of Representatives who I know is real emotionally charged about this issue, higher education, as I am. And my tweet yesterday was relating to that. And it's really what motivated the tweet when I read the article. We've got 45 million people in America. I mean, think of this. The country's got 325-ish million people in it. We got about 45 million people in America who have student debt. The student debt totals $1.5 trillion. Let's think of that. I mean, we got student debt in America today is 1.487. This is as of the last day in May 2018, 1.4725 or something thereabout. We're rounding off. It's probably 1.5 today. I mean, somebody probably borrowed some money between the end of May and now to get it to $1.5 trillion. The Brookings Institute is predicting by the year 2025, which is 7 years from now, 40 to 45% of that student debt will be in default. There's some payments due. Now, they'll tell you that only 11 or 12% are in default. And that's factual. I mean, only about 11 or 12%. That's still a lot. I mean, the housing calamity was caused by 8% of home mortgages being in default. And if you remember The Big Short, Michael Burry's formula was based on when the default rate got over 7%. I mean, that was his. He said, this thing will blow sky high once the default rate gets to 7%. That's when we'll just have absolute chaos on our hands. And we know how that worked out. I mean, we know how the world blew up in 2008.
Not too good.
I mean, it's terrible. I mean, the taxpayer's on the hook for, north of $1 trillion when you consider everything collectively. But in the housing fiasco, there was a tangible asset of which to liquidate. The house may not have been worth $600,000 in Miami Beach, but may have been worth $300,000 or $250,000. It was a home. It was a something of real intrinsic value. And the debate I've always had and try to consider as I study and read this, where I'm trying to go is for an in-state student to go to the University of South Carolina, and you know how much I love my Gamecocks, and that is the only university my daughter even considers. I mean, she doesn't even think about it. And maybe that changes. She's a rising sophomore, so maybe she begins to change her mind. And as critical as I am of the whether college is worth it or not question, she'll probably end up going to college because I'm as brainwashed as the rest of everybody else is, I would imagine. But I started looking through some numbers last night. And once again, Burray, who was a medical doctor and an astute mathematician, and he went through and he looked at all these mortgages and he hired a team of people, smart people. They went through all these mortgages, and they basically hedged on the fact that they believed at some point in time 7% of the mortgages in America were going to be in default. And he said, when that happens, it is absolutely unbelievable, the carnage that'll be left in its wake. And he was right. Now, he was right a year later than he thought he was going to be right. You remember the scene in the movie when he says, there are two things I'm sure of. It's going to happen, and I don't know when. We may be a year early, and he took all of the money. He was running a fund, a big hedge fund. He took all of that money, and he invested in they basically shorted, and Goldman Sachs had to create an instrument. J.P. Morgan had to create an instrument. If you remember the scene, and I know Superman don't fly, but movies have some texture of reality associated. And The Big Short was based on a true story. It was a book, and it was about a real guy who got incredibly wealthy, shorting the housing market. And he walks into Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan and Deutsche Bank, and they look at him and say, you want to short the housing market? Are you serious? Absolutely, we'll take your money. We don't have an instrument, but we'll create one. Come back and see us in, 2 weeks. And Goldman Sachs created an instrument, and J.P. Morgan created one, and Deutsche Bank created one, and, Citibank created one. And he invested north of $1 billion, but basically on instruments that didn't exist at the time. Because what were we told, Rev? What were you and I told as young people? And here's where I want to get. What were you and I told as young people? The best investment you can make is home ownership.
Right. It will always appreciate.
It'll always appreciate. Nothing ever changes. You got to believe me on that. The world can ebb and flow, and, stocks can go up and down, and Wall Street can have, good times and bad times. The economy can be in recessions and then experience a lot of growth. But home ownership is the pathway to prosperity. Nothing will ever change in relation to that. Well, some didn't believe it, and some jumped in with Michael, Burry, however you want to pronounce his name, and got incredibly wealthy off other people's misfortune. I mean, in essence, that's the closing scene. He said, if we cash this thing in, we're no different than the rest. We've made multiple billions of dollars for me and my investors, but we've taken advantage of other people's lives falling apart. If you send your kid to the University of South Carolina today, it's $25,000 a year in state tuition. Why don't you let that sink in for a second? In a state where the average income is about $40,000, about $39,500, the price to educate your child at its flagship university is $25,000 a year. Higher education in South Carolina from the year 1987 has gone up 761%. Housing has gone up 130%. Healthcare has gone up 240%. Now, the national average in the increase of tuition is 560%. So that's one place South Carolina's outperformed the national average.
Great.
So let your head wrap itself around that for a second. You've got a state where the average income is just south of $40,000 a year. I'm not talking about the median income. You hear some of this median income at, 49, 50, 51, depending on what group of analysts you want to believe. But the average income in America is in South Carolina is about $40,000 a year. And it costs $25,000 per year for your child to get a degree at its flagship university. You can major in psychology, or you can major in Greek literature, or you can major in Shakespearean theater. Or I would imagine you can major in, the School of Business, which I'm sure would be far more lucrative. And this is a sidebar question. Why do we lend kids as much money to get degrees in Greek literature as we do petroleum engineering? And we've had this debate many times on this show. And I think of certain callers I don't know how you get defended anymore. I really don't. And I know the people. I know several of the people real well on these boards of trustees, and I know their heart, and I know their intellect, and I know the soundness of their judgment, and I still don't understand how you rationalize it. I understand the cuts in state funding. I understand the General Assembly doesn't honor its obligation to higher education, and I think that may be where we end up. Is higher education a fundamental role of government? Of course not. Now we've accepted responsibility at it being a fundamental role of government, but I use the Home story or the Big Short story because we were told for a couple of generations there's no way a home's a bad investment. And we found out the hard way that at some point it is. When a good, a commodity, or a service becomes so extremely overpriced, it creates a bubble. Anybody knows that. That's not some creative economic theory. When a good, a commodity, or a service becomes so incredibly overpriced, it absolutely must create a bubble. And the bubble burst. And there's never been a bubble that didn't burst. And what I've always argued is, who's on the hook when this bubble burst? As I said, $600,000 mortgage on a house in Miami, it ain't worth zero. There's some number, there's some write down, there's some financial model that allows for the bank to sell it and take a loss and move on and try to make it up somewhere. Do we extract the educations out of the skulls of these young people? Do they hand over their degree in Greek literature or general studies or whatever? And when I read the Brookings Institute's probably done as much research on this as anybody from a nonpartisan perspective. And they believe that 40%, because I go back to the 11%. Remember, 7 or 8% was the number of default when Michael Burry said, we're going to get rich. Now, other people are going to get their butts handed to them, but we're going to get rich. People are going to get kicked out of their homes. They're going to lose their livelihoods, but we're going to put a lot of money in the bank because the system can afford 7 or 8%. Well, we figured out a way in higher education for the system to absorb 11%. And here's how we've done it. 11% are in default. You ever heard of what deferment is?
Mm-hmm.
That's when we're going to kick the can down the road. We're going to loan you this money, anticipating one day you get a job. And the deferment plans become longer and longer and longer. And Brookings Institute is arguing that at some point in time, you can't continue to defer the debt. You got to start servicing the debt at some point in time. It's a little bit like if you're a business guy like me. The bank will give you a certain period of time on interest only. I mean, if you're starting a business, if you're doing something, that there's a period of time, and you're always haggling with them. You wanted another year, and they wanted it. We got to convert it to principal and interest now. And you're always the business guy. So no, let me have another year of interest only. Well, I mean, in the long run, you got to begin paying principal at some point in time. You owe them $1 million. You're servicing it with nothing but interest only. You wanted another year and another year and another year. Why? Because it helps cash flow. Well, that's kind of what's happened in higher education. We got a group of people in college and graduated from college that we understand can't make the payments. And we've gotten real creative with deferment plans. The debt's still there. It's not in default. It's not a part of the 11%. But it's about 25% of all student debt is in deferment. And what Brookings is arguing is over the next 10 years or over the next 7 years in their model, some of this debt's got to be chewed out. I mean, some of this debt's got to be worked on. And I just believe that we are going to be in the biggest mess imaginable because there is no tangible asset to liquidate. And I read this article last night, and I'm going like, darn, man, I love the Gamecocks. But a 4-year degree at the University of South Carolina, if you don't take 5 like a lot of people do, a 4-year degree, consecutive years, cost you $100,000. Not a degree from Harvard, not a degree from MIT, not a degree from Yale, not a degree from Vanderbilt. That there's some degrees you can rationalize. You really can. You can say, well, the fraternity of people who graduated from Harvard is to such a place that I believe that's a sound investment. And I just wonder in a very hearty way, how you justify paying $100,000 for your kid to have a degree. And I'm not picking on the University of South Carolina. They just happen to be in the news because they made their tuition increase early this week because their board of trustees voted on the increase. I'm sure it's very similar at Clemson, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. I don't know. But that's kind of where they're all going to be. I use them as an example because they are the flagship university of our state, the largest university in our state. How do you make that work? I mean, how do you believe that a degree in something other than petroleum engineering or chemical engineering or medicine or law? I mean, there are certain specialized degrees that absolutely have a benefit on the backside. I just don't. And when we come back, we got to take a break. I know we're getting behind. When we come back, I'm going to show you an example of the absurd reacting to the absurd. We've got a game show coming out in America in a month or so that basically plays off the enormous amount of student debt in America today. Back in a minute. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Schofield's. Good morning, PD Live 95.